I know it's right at the top of the hour, so we'll probably have a couple people join us. So we'll get into this a little slowly and then dive into the topic here. But we'll be talking about board members and how we keep board members engaged. One second here to move my screen forward. There we go. So when we think about board engagement, just a couple of things contextually before we get into the specific tips, because like I said, I know a few folks were taking a short break after the last session before they come over and head over here. What we're seeing from boards overall mirrors a little bit what we're seeing from staff. Boards are in a better spot today than they were a couple of years ago, much like many parts of our organization probably, but specifically around engagement. You know, a year or two ago, we really saw board engagement hit a low point, and that was for two big reasons we saw. One was the fact that during the pandemic, so in that kind of 2020 to 2022 realm, a lot of board activities were virtual, almost all. While a lot of staff started doing hybrid at some point of that, boards didn't really start coming back in person for most organizations, not all, but most organizations, until late and kind of mid to late 2022. So during that time, especially if they brought on new board members, it was really hard to build that culture of engagement, the same connections, right? The same going out to dinner after a meeting, right? Meeting each other, getting to know each other. And that led to a lack of engagement because of the culture building, kind of group building being a challenge for folks. The second thing there was the fact that board members, like all of us, just had a lot of things going on, right? Adjusting back to work, adjusting back to maybe going into the office, you know, economic concerns, job concerns, et cetera, right? So we saw board members, because of both the higher level of stress as well as the lack of culture building for the couple of years before, really hit a low point of engagement in kind of early 2023, late 2022. What this is looking like now, about a year later, is that we are seeing signs of improvement here. So as we talk to nonprofit executive directors, as we talk to senior development staff about their boards, we're hearing more positive things. Still not as strong as maybe it was a few years ago. Still, as always, even a few years ago, an opportunity to have more board engagement than we do. But it does seem like it's on the upward trend. While we're also talking about kind of less donors in the space right now, we're talking about less volunteers in the space. We're actually seeing a lot of interest from the community around board service. So people are looking to make meaningful contributions locally, right? And board service is one of those options. And they're looking to build community. There's a real desire that whatever civically they're doing is also leading to new relationships, new connections they're building, and board service is a good opportunity for that. The final thing I'll say contextually as we then dive into the tips and tricks now that we're a few minutes into the top of the hour, is that the biggest barrier we see to kind of some more great board members looking at organizations like y'all's and thinking about joining is them not seeing themselves as board member material. So too many folks that we talk to that would be great board candidates, you know, folks that are in their 30s or 40s are doing really great work at different companies, would be really great to be on a nonprofit board. Don't think they can be because they have this idea that you have to be really senior in your career. You have to have a certain level of wealth. You have to have a certain level of network. And most of those are kind of overblown in terms of kind of the reality. Many of our partners be excited to have these folks that we're talking to on their board. So there's a real need to continue to kind of shift who sees themselves as a potential board member. That is one reason why we see boards being much slower to diversify than nonprofit staff leadership, right? So 40% of our partners are led by a person of color now. Only 16% of boards locally are majority person of color on the board, right? And one reason for that kind of slower, both racial but also age diversity on boards is the fact that people don't see themselves as a board member. So with that context, interested community, could be more of the community if we help kind of share that message and change that narrative about who could be a board member. And engagement is better, but still not where we want it to be. We'll dive on into kind of some of our tips and strategies today around board member engagement. So the first piece we'll talk about with this is around board commitment. So when we think about board commitment, there's a lot of things we can talk about here. There's a few different tips we'll share. The most important, though, I would say, probably the one tip or tool or kind of worksheet we see has the biggest impact on organizations and their boards is adopting an individual commitment form. Feel free to, if you want to just put in the chat, if you have an individual commitment form right now, it'd be great to kind of just share that. I'd be curious to see how many people do. Typically, when we talk to organizations, about half do. So about 50% of organizations have an individual commitment form for their board, about 50% don't. So what is an individual commitment form if you're not familiar with it, or maybe you have one but you haven't really dove into it? It's just an annual agreement that every board member is going to fill out, outlining their expectations for participation on the board, right? So basically, it's a once-a-year form you fill out that's saying all the different things you're kind of committing to do as a board member. The reason why this is so important is because the number one reason that board and staff sometimes don't get along right, sometimes have some challenges. The number one reason, most common, is miscommunication around differing expectations, right? So staff think board's going to show up to all these things. They're going to help with fundraising. They're going to bring in a bunch of money. They're going to donate a lot. And sometimes those expectations are unrealistic. This is not just on the board member side. Sometimes staff are being unrealistic about what they are asking board members for, or thinking that board members are going to do. And on the flip side, board members think that, oh, well, maybe if I just, write my check for my give or get, I'm good. I don't really need to do anything else, right? Obviously, the truth is somewhere in the middle there. So it's really important that we have this individual commitment form that's setting out expectations for board members so that staff and board know what's expected of them, right? We talked about this in one of the staff accountability workshops earlier today. But if we don't have shared expectations with staff on performance, it's really hard to hold them accountable. And it's also really hard to know if they're being successful or not, right? This is kind of the same thing with the board. If I don't have a set of expectations for the board, it's hard for me to tell them to do more or do something differently. It's also hard for me to know if they're doing enough, right? Or for them to know if they're doing enough. So what goes in this individual commitment form? And I will say there's an example of this template in your workbook. So you do have an example of this already. So if you don't have one, if you want to compare yours to this, that template is in there. We'll include a few different things. People always ask about this part, so I'll talk about that in just a second. The financial expectation, that should be in the commitment form, but it shouldn't be the only thing. So there's a couple of kind of broad things we usually include around kind of being a good ambassador of the brand, right, in the community. We're going to include kind of board meeting attendance expectations in there. We're going to include event attendance expectations in there. If there's an expectation they serve on a committee, we're going to put that in there. We see sometimes people put that expectation after a couple of years on the board that they'll volunteer for some type of leadership role with the committee or with the executive committee. So a lot of things you could put in there. At minimum, I would say the places you want them to show up, the behaviors you want them to emulate, and then the financial expectation. Probably only needs to be about a page long, right? Page and a half at most, depending on kind of how you're formatting it. And you'll see that in the template that we provide too. It's roughly kind of a page long there. Two important things to make sure that it includes is that it describes their role in fundraising beyond their own give or get, right? So if you have a give or get, right, so board members have to give or get a certain amount of money, I want to make sure my board understands that we're also going to ask you to write some thank you letters, hop on a thank you call, right, or help us with sourcing prospects. So there's these other kind of there's these other fundraising activities that aren't necessarily financial in nature, but are really important for kind of board members to be aware of. And then finally, we are putting the financial expectation on there. So if you have a give or get for the board, right, everyone give or gets this amount of money, you can put that on there, and people are just signing on to it. We often get asked kind of what that is typically for organizations. The average across our partners is $1,000 give or get. Some have much higher than that. Some have lower than that. The national average is 5,000, but that includes a lot bigger nonprofits than typically are in our network. And about 40% of organizations these days, 35, 40%, don't have a specific give or get. And that's actually our recommendation for most cases. For sometimes, especially if you struggle with kind of board engagement, it might be nice to just have that give or get to make sure that someone's doing something. But in most cases, we really prefer not to have a specific number, but instead telling folks that it needs to be one of your top 3 philanthropic gifts. So for every board member, one of their top 3 gifts that year needs to be to your organization if they're going to serve on your board. Why we like doing that is because a couple of reasons. One, it allows for a little greater diversity on the board. I might have folks that are going to be really great assets for us. They're really well networked. They're really well known. They might be able to do some really great pro bono work for us. They can't give at the same level, right? Or they might be a little more junior in their career, et cetera. So it gives me a little flexibility, right, on who I can bring in there. And it also doesn't leave money on the table, right? We might have a couple board members who could easily give 15, but because our give gets 5, they're just giving 5,000, right? But if instead we're equalizing the priority of the gift, not the amount of the gift, we can maximize the amount we're raising there. A little bit more management of the board to do that, but that's the idea. We can put that kind of blank line in the commitment form. So when they're signing that annual commitment form, they're writing in, I plan to give $2,000. My name is Matt, and I'm going to do all these things. Why this is so great and why this is, for a pretty simple document, relatively transformational for a lot of boards, is that it changes the accountability conversation. Without this kind of in writing kind of document to refer to, I then, as the ED, or I, as the board chair, have to use a board member, a volunteer who's there completely voluntarily, and try to hold you accountable for doing all these things, right? That you can either claim you forgot about or you didn't know about. And it really makes it a pretty quickly, in a lot of cases, personal conversation, right? Around like, you're not doing what we wanted you to do. Instead, though, if we have this commitment form signed out, it takes the personal out of it a little bit. So we're able to go back and say, like, hey, Tom, you said you were going to attend, 80% of meetings. It's halfway through the year. You've only been to half of meetings. Let's talk about why that's happening, right? It allows for the beginning of a conversation about why something may not be occurring, instead of kind of an overly kind of negative or aggressive or kind of personal conversation. So the commitment form we see really protects the relationship a lot of times between board member and board chair, board member and ED. And also allows for just a pretty matter-of-fact conversation around like, hey, you signed this, you knew this, it's not happening. Why is it not happening? Sometimes that's because they just have other things on their plate. Sometimes it's because maybe this isn't the right time for them to be on the board because the commitment is too great for them. So individual commitment form definitely are our number one tenet there about engaging board members. Secondly, we think about how we're getting board members kind of more involved in fundraising, right? Someone was asking, could you point me in the direction of the workbook with the links? Yes, yeah, we can post that, and we'll also make sure that that's shared after the summit as well. So if that is not in the current version of the workbook, we'll definitely add it to it. We wanted to try to keep that resource guide for you all not too cumbersome. So there's a few things we're going to add post-summit as well. Someone's saying their board's getting ready to sign a commitment form now that they put together. That's great. And that's a really good point, actually. If you have an opportunity to have the board weigh in and give feedback on the commitment form before you have them sign it, even better, right? Because you get that kind of buy-in to it because they kind of helped co-create it. And someone else talked about the fact they're doing it, but it's really hard to get it back from people. Definitely agreed. Always a challenge, right? If possible, we've encouraged folks to kind of tell board members ahead of time, like send in the board packet a week before a meeting. And if you're having an in-person meeting, actually show up with the physical copies there and trying to get people to kind of sign it on the spot, knowing ahead of time that it's coming so they can think about the giving amount they want to put on there if they're writing in their kind of giving total. Still not going to get everybody right off the bat, but it does kind of, we see increase how many people are filling it out. All right, so when we think about board fundraising, the big thing here we want to help shift for board members is that this isn't just a check writing process. Now, don't get me wrong, we love that check, right? We'll definitely take that check from a board member, but we also want them to get used to thinking about, in addition to the give that they're doing personally, we want them to make introductions for us, help connect us to folks, and at times represent our organization at different kind of community events or different events that they might get invited to. In addition to these 3 things that really should get forth, and there often is when we're diving into this kind of board fundraising topic a little deeper, which is around stewardship. Board members are an incredible asset when it comes to thanking donors. Every donor don't even really understand why fully, but every donor loves hearing from a board member, right? Loves getting that little postcard, loves getting a little voicemail that might be left. It's a really easy way for board members to engage and help, and something really simple that they can do. If you have some newer board members or younger board members who maybe are uncomfortable with kind of fundraising yet, uh, getting them involved in the stewardship piece is a great place to start. It's usually a relatively easy thing for them to do, and they get some real kind of benefit from it for the organization. Our third tip here around these things we're asking board members to do is to think about how we create accountability. And why we always kind of highlight this part is we like to shift a little bit. We hear a lot of folks we talk to that have been trying to get their board, let's just stay on the topic of fundraising. I've been trying to get their board to fundraise for years, right, at this point, or at least what feels like years. Haven't done so successfully. And it creates this kind of just expectation that they're not going to do it, right? The ED might still send the email asking, but there's no expectation they're going to do anything around it. And it quickly becomes that the board doesn't want to help, right? It's kind of the narrative that staff build, which is a rational narrative to build, right, from that and understandable. But most of the time we see, folks sign up for this board voluntarily. They probably at some point did want to help and have an impact. So why are they not, right? So kind of shifting it from they're probably actively choosing to not do it to there might be something that's missing them that's kind of holding them back from kind of taking on some of those tasks we're asking them to do. So the first is that a lot of times we may just need to explain what we're asking for differently or in a slightly more kind of detailed way. So just being very clear about here's specifically where I'm asking you to talk to 3 people about coming to our event, right? Being incredibly specific about what we're asking for, giving them a timeline, right? We need those people by May 1st because our event's in June and we want to make sure we have a seat for them. How we're kind of thinking about success here, right? Thinking about the process a lot of times. So a lot of times board members check out because they'll ask someone, that person says no, then they're like, I'm failing at this, I'm not good at this, I'm not going to keep asking, right? So changing it from we need each board member to raise $500 from their friends, and we need each board member to ask 10 friends. Now, for some board members, if they ask 10 friends, that might raise $10,000 or it might raise $0. But we're making the metric of success the thing we really want them to do about the process, not the outcome. Right. So I'm not asking my board members to run a peer-to-peer campaign and each one raise $5,000. I'm asking them to run a peer-to-peer campaign and try to get 25 people to donate, right? Or try to get 10 people to donate and half those people get one other person, whatever that looks like. If they are committing to a number, it's because they're doing kind of the math backwards from kind of the process that they're committing to. So thinking about how can we change that from an outcome to a process metric that we're asking them to be evaluated on. And then finally, in this case, not who they report to, but who can they go to if they need help, right? Is it the committee chair? Is it the board chair? Is it the executive director? Is it the development staff? But making sure they know who they can ask questions to if one of their donors is like, hey, like, what about this thing around your programming? Making sure they know where they can get that information. The second thing we see about why board members may not follow through with some of these tasks is they may not understand really what's important about it, right? Or kind of why this matters so much, right? Why does it really matter I'm sharing this? Why does it really matter that I'm signing up to this peer-to-peer campaign? Why does it matter that we have 100% of the board giving, right? So walking them through some of those things around like board giving is a metric that foundations look at sometimes when they're considering us for grants. Getting the word out there is really important because donor acquisition is really tough right now. So actually, you kind of sharing this is the best strategy we have for getting new donors in the door. And as board members become aware of kind of the importance of some of the things we're asking them to do, we see more are more likely to kind of take it up. The other kind of thing we want to highlight here are some barriers. This is true for staff as well when we give them a new task that keep people from doing things, right? So the first, and this probably happens the least often with board, is an organizational barrier. So they don't feel like they have the empowerment to do the thing we're asking them to do. That's probably not true because we're kind of trying to empower them left and right, right? To go do fundraising or go do these other kind of tasks that we're asking for. So it comes down more often than not to board members running into a knowledge barrier or a motivation barrier. Motivation we just talked about, right? Walking through the why. helping them understand kind of why this is really important. The other thing we can do with a motivational barrier there is trying to let them know some success stories on the board. So what we don't want to do here is kind of go to like a negative peer pressure, like, hey, like, you need to do this because everyone else is doing it. But if we do have a couple of board members who are really thriving at some of this, and really kind of, inviting a bunch of people to an event, fundraising a lot, etc., highlight that, highlight those wins. And the more those wins are celebrated, the more others are going to want to be celebrated, and they're likely to kind of replicate those wins themselves. Um, the final barrier, though, and this is the one that we see most often is true for board members, is a knowledge barrier. A lot of us that, even if you didn't naturally love fundraising, you've come to do it, know it, understand it throughout your career, throughout your work. Uh, so we forget the fact that for a lot of our board members, especially those coming from the for-profit space, they maybe have never asked anyone for money for anything before, right? They haven't necessarily fundraised before. This isn't what they're doing at their day job. Depending on their job, they may not, even have kind of an analogous skill that they have to use on a regular basis. So that causes a lot of kind of fear for board members, uncomfortability for board members, kind of fundraising, but also some of the other tasks we might be asked to do around research or things like that, inviting people to an event. So it's important that we're kind of giving them some training, right, on this. We're walking them through how to talk about the organization, and we're giving them some resources, right? So, if I'm asking my board members to send a fundraising email for us, we're giving them a template, preferably two. That is one kind of specific hack we've seen. That giving two templates to board members, having them choose between, actually makes them more likely to use it because they feel a sense of ownership instead of just kind of taking the one template and using it. Being able to choose between it, maybe the tone's slightly different or the length is slightly different. We see they're more likely to use it in that case. But thinking about how can we address this knowledge barrier, making sure board members feel confident enough to do the task that we're asking them to do. And then finally, we're thinking about, for board members, how are we kind of routinely checking in with individual board members to see how their engagement's doing? We'll talk about board evaluation a little bit later and also in another session as well. But when we think about our board members, uh, what are our checkpoints, right? We usually have a pretty good process for this when they're new during board onboarding. But after that, there's often not really a formal way we're routinely talking to them. So I want to think through how we're doing that. The first is that, especially for board members, then for all members, hopefully once a year, they're having a one-on-one meeting with the executive director. Now, depending on the size of your board, that may no longer be tenable, right? If you have 25 plus board members, majority of boards that we work with, that our partners have and work with, are somewhere in the 9 to 15, right? And while 9 to 15 meetings isn't something small, it's really important to do, right? It's really important to have that engagement with board members. It's how the ED can kind of get them curious and interested in specific parts of the work, right, that they might care about more than others, and build that kind of personal relationship. So investing in that at least once or twice, especially if you're new or they're new, really important. So that's an annual check-in. Another annual check-in is with the board chair, right? So checking in every member with the board chair at least once a year, if not kind of a couple times a year, depending on how engaged the board chair is themselves. That's a really great touch point. And if your board chair is asking how else can I help, that is the best way, right? That takes that off the ED's plate. And the board chair making just a couple quick kind of board wellness calls to see how folks are doing, to see what questions they have, to see how their engagement's doing. Really helpful there. Other ways that we're engaging and kind of monitoring board engagement is on committees, right? So getting new and old members kind of plugged into committees, making sure those committees are actually meeting. So people are not just attending the big board meetings that they may not be actively participating in. They are attending smaller committee meetings on a regular basis where they kind of have to participate. And that's a great kind of driver of that engagement and reinforcer of it once they are engaged. Want to make sure that at our board meetings that other people are getting their voices involved, right? So it's not just the executive director monologuing for the entire meeting, right? But the ED, the board chair, and some other board leaders, including kind of committee chairs, are owning parts of the agenda and getting their voices heard. As they speak, and as more of them speak, more people will see themselves in those roles, be more likely to engage. Then finally, inviting board members to events, right? They may not always be able to go, right? Inviting them to site visits or other events we're having, but by making the invitation, right, they feel included, right? It's the same thing we see with donors. They may not come, but they appreciate the invite and the relationship is stronger as a result. So using it as an opportunity to engage board members can be really helpful. All right, so the next thing I want to talk about is actually one of the more important pieces around kind of engaging our board members, which is the actual board meetings we're having with them, right? So we just talked about several things that we could do kind of structurally to engage board members, the commitment form, right? Some accountability check-ins. But board meetings are actually the one thing that, at least in most cases, all board members are going to, right? Or at least all board members are going to the majority of them. And when asked, if I was to ask each of you right now, like, would you describe your board meetings as interesting or as engaging? Usually, that's not a common answer of yes, right? And we want it to be. We really want these meetings to be really powerful, to really purposeful, not only to help move the organization forward, but this is our best time to engage board members, right? They're there, they're paying attention, they're engaged with content, they're a captive audience for a small period of time, much more so than when they're distractedly reading our emails, right, or doing something else. So it's important we're using those meetings to really drive their engagement and kind of move their engagement forward. So the first tip here around making more engaging board meetings and engaging our board members as a result is around kind of how we prepare for those board meetings, right? So logistics and the speakers and the materials. So logistically, the majority of board meetings we hear about, the majority of partners we talk to with their board meetings have moved back in person. Probably about, I'd say, 80% of our partners have in-person board meetings again. But there is a solid number that have stayed virtual. A few have tried hybrid. Hybrid's really hard to pull off for a board meeting, kind of have real engagement on both sides of the screen. But a couple of people have done it. Some people are staying virtual. Their board either got used to it, really likes not having to come together, or for a variety of reasons, they kind of decided to stay virtual there. So if it is virtual, either way, virtual or in person, we want to give advance notice. We want to make sure the board knows, hey, for the next 3 meetings, we're going to be in person, we're going to be virtual, it's going to be a mix, because that's going to impact kind of our plan a little bit for the content. In terms of frequency, a few years ago, bi-monthly meetings were the most common frequency across our network, so 6 meetings a year. That's actually decreased to quarterly. So quarterly is now the most common, bi-monthly a very close second, monthly now a pretty far distant third. I think that happened in part because of the board engagement challenges a couple of years back, but also virtual communication, right, Zooms, etc. It happens so much easier now. There's other opportunities to check in with board leadership and staff leadership than formal meetings. If you are going to do a virtual board meeting, again, if you're doing a virtual board meeting every time, it is going to be hard to build that kind of culture and engagement on the board. But if you're doing any one meeting virtually, you can have a lot of great success there. Think about how to use the chat, right, to get kind of board members talking to each other. Breakout rooms. So if you're doing a discussion virtually and no one's saying anything, put your board members in small breakout rooms, 2 or 3 people, have them discuss, bring it back. That actually sometimes lead to better conversation than it does in person. Make sure you're planning to screen share, right, that everyone's on the same page. And again, polls are another good example that there are some tools we can use virtually to actually make the meeting more engaging than it might be in person, but ultimately the relational piece of that in-person meeting usually is going to kind of beat out any other benefits we see of kind of doing it virtually. In terms of kind of who's speaking at the meeting, we'll talk about the agenda here in just a second. But we want to, again, as we said on the previous slide, get beyond just the board chair and executive director. If it's virtual, this is even more important because it's easier to be monotonous when you're virtually during a board meeting like this. We want to make sure that at least 2 weeks ahead of time, any committee chairs or board members that are speaking are kind of prepped and ready to go on this. We're handing over real ownership. So the treasurer really is owning the finance report. The fundraising chair is really owning the fundraising report. As that happens, not only is it going to drive more discussion amongst board members are more likely to respond to another board member than they are to you necessarily as a board leadership person or an executive director. Uh, it's going to model that ownership for others, making more board members likely to step up and own some of the work. And finally, this is always right the goal. It doesn't necessarily happen, but still the goal to work towards, which is getting the materials to the board a week ahead of time. At minimum, kind of 3 or 4 kind of business days ahead of time. And again, if right now you're sending stuff day of, set a first step goal of getting kind of 2 or 3 days ahead of time, and then kind of maybe by end of year, kind of getting to that week part or at least 5 days part. The reason why it's important we're sending it this far ahead of time is that we want to make sure we're giving the board every chance to read through the packet that we're sending. So if they didn't, it's firmly not staff or organizational fault, right? We're giving them the opportunity. We're telling them about it. They have the chance to engage with it. If they choose not to, we're expecting that they're not going to be doing that kind of during the meeting, right? What it looks like when we put in that packet, we don't want to put everything in the kitchen sink. We want it to be readable. So we're including the agenda, we're including a part of the consent agenda, so like the last minutes from the meeting, financial reports, program report, and then any documents that are going to kind of supplement the conversation we're going to have at the meeting. So when we think about the agenda for the meeting, it's probably the most important part. We'll talk about an example of the agenda here on the next slide. We want to start with a consent agenda. What this is simply all those procedural things we kind of just vote on at the beginning of meetings, right? Do you approve the minutes from the last meeting? Do you approve these financial reports? Do you approve the program report? Any of those things we just kind of routinely are always voting yes on. Maybe we have a question or two, or we catch a small error in the minutes or something, but it's usually a pretty quick conversation. Want to include all that in the packet ahead of time, ask people to read it, ask for any questions on it at the beginning of the meeting. If there aren't any questions, you have to resolve those questions, call for a vote, approve it, and then be done, right? We want to shift from our meetings being largely procedural votes and instead being really focused on the majority of the meeting time is spent with 1 to 2 major kind of key questions we want to ask the board. So the majority of the time is focused on those kind of 1 to 2 key points that are usually a question about some type of strategy, program update, program idea, kind of branding, marketing, whatever it might be. But they're strategic questions. Why this is important is not only is it going to get us more benefit from these meetings, right? We're going to learn things we need to know. We should be asking questions we're actually interested in hearing the answer to. That's the best hallmark that the question's a good one for the organization, right? It's also going to be more engaging for board members, right? Board members join to offer strategic guidance to the organization, right? To offer their ideas. And this is a way to do it in a structured way that isn't in the weeds, is at the appropriate strategic level, is going to be helpful to you, but also then engaging for them. If there's other votes you need to do, right, we're voting on a new board member, we have to approve something else. We'll do those procedural votes at the end, but hopefully relatively quickly. So an example agenda, right, the typical board meeting we see these days is about 75 minutes long, with then a little bit of time for executive session. So somewhere between 90 minutes total, 60 minutes on the low end. So in this example, it starts with kind of a welcome and mission moment, checking who's in the space. Mission moment we can talk more about later. It's basically kicking off the meeting with some type of reminder to the board about why they care about this work, right? It's really easy when we start looking at just kind of budget projections and financial reports and meeting minutes to forget why people joined the board in the first place, why you as a staff member love and work for the organization. So some type of mission moment, whether that's a client impact story or something else, that reminds them and roots them in that this matters and that what we're doing here kind of matters. So from that kind of emotional kind of kickoff, really getting people engaged, we do the consent agenda relatively quickly, right? Where we're asking for any questions, voting to approve, moving on from it, and then diving into those discussions. If you have a really big topic to talk about, it could just be one topic, but most time we see a benefit to having two. Um, 40, 45 minutes is a long time to talk about one thing. So having those two discussions can be helpful there. Any final needed votes, adjourn to executive session. If you don't currently do executive session, what that is simply the board meeting without the executive director. It can be really short. It's usually just asking the board how they felt the meeting went and if they had any questions that they didn't ask during the time. But if there is anything the board needs to talk about, either the board's own performance or the ED's performance, they can do it then. This is the best practice because it helps the board begin to own its own work and kind of self-manage a little bit. Uh, Depending on the engagement of your current board chair, I know we talk to boards sometimes that just aren't ready to do those yet, don't really have the facilitator for it. But as you're able to, working those into meetings on a regular basis can be really powerful. And then, especially if you're doing quarterly board meetings, having some type of optional social activity afterwards. This isn't going to be right for every board culture, and definitely isn't going to kind of work if you're virtual. You can do kind of the virtual gathering, but that's kind of tougher to do, and I wouldn't do it every time. But if you're in person and it fits culturally, we'd recommend doing some type of optional social time after the meeting because the more the board's connected to each other, the more likely they are to show up for stuff. So we want to build those social connections between board members. For what goes into those key discussions, right? So what do I fill my meetings with? What are some of the big things that we could talk about there? Usually it's going to fall into kind of one of the big buckets of the organization, right? Programmatic financial strategy. So, programmatically, right? A good example, are we going to do something new, right? Are we going to bring something back? Are we going to try to expand something? But, strategic questions about kind of growth programmatically or kind of alignment. Financially, right? Looking at kind of projections or budget or cash flow, right? Asking some of those bigger questions around our performance and how we're feeling about the financial state of the organization. Strategic planning, strategic value setting, goal setting, checking in on kind of progress towards goals. Any of that's going to fall in that kind of strategic bucket. Then obviously board, DEI, equity, justice, other values we might be committing to. Any of these are great topics for those kind of one or two discussions. And probably at least one of these already would be top of mind for us if we were talking to our board. Secondly, it's really important that during those key discussions, our goal is that there's a back and forth conversation. So my goal during that key discussion is not to make a fancy PowerPoint, do a great presentation, have some questions, I answer, then we're all done. I really want my board talking to each other. That's like the hallmark of success for these key conversations, is that during the meeting, we're talking about board recruitment and how it's really critical, and the board is talking to the board about that recruitment topic. Why is this so important? Why this becomes like my kind of metric of success again for this is that as they're talking to each other, that means that there's real engagement and real processing, right, and real kind of acknowledgement and listening about the topic between at least the two board members talking about it, right? So we want to see if we can kind of drive that a little bit, and again, decenter ourselves from that conversation and have more board members connecting with each other on it. Some of the ways that we can make it more likely that that peer-to-peer conversation occurs, having a board member introduce the topic instead of us, right? If I say something, if the board chair says something, it's like when the teacher asks something in class, right? The students can kind of ignore that. But if one of those board members is bringing it up to the other board members, much more likely to talk about it, much more likely to kind of bring up a conversation around it, much more likely to respond. Secondly, making sure we're giving those materials and background info ahead of time so that folks know what we're going to talk about, how they can prep for it, and if they don't know a lot about it, they can learn enough to fully engage in the conversation. If we have a bigger board, so I would say over kind of 7 or 8 people, want to think about how we can use small groups, right? Just like we would kind of virtually with breakout rooms, how can we even in person, right, kind of go to different corners of the room and actually have some like structured conversation around some of these items. That again, as they talk to each other, then come back and share out with the whole group, it's going to increase the likelihood of their engagement. And finally, if none of the rest of this is working, never hurts to kind of prepare some participation, right? So if we have a board member or two, if we have a board chair or vice chair that's willing to plan to talk, plan to ask a question after something, that can be a great thing to kind of tick off and kind of spur more conversation on the topic. And then finally, these conversations should be focused. So we're not going to have strategic conversations at the board meeting. And the first question is like, how do we get more money? Right? Like we want to be more focused on that, want to be specific, want to have something they're responding to and something they can really dive in. So, another version of that question, right, would be, what revenue opportunities do we feel like are most likely to be able to grow, right? Or how would we like to diversify our revenue? How do we feel about the mix of revenue we have right now? As we get those more specific questions, there are going to be more specific answers, more specific ideas hopefully offered by board members as well. And I talked briefly about this earlier, but just a couple other examples that y'all can take back with you. Kicking off every board meeting with a mission moment. And again, a mission moment is just something we do at the beginning of the meeting to remind board members why they care about this work and why it matters that we get this right? And why it matters that they invest in the work. So a couple examples of what that could look like. Could be a client or volunteer story that we record ahead of time or even kind of bring in live if it's not realistic to bring in a client or volunteer to the meeting. Some type of written testimonial from impact staff, right, about client stories that they're seeing and the difference that's happening on the ground. It doesn't always have to be things we're telling them. So two things that's interesting is sometimes having a conversation with board members, right? So starting a board meeting off, and I wouldn't do this more than once or twice a year, but once or twice a year by asking, why did you first join the board, right? For some of you, it might have been months ago. For others, it might have been years ago. But what got you to first join the board? Or no matter how long you joined it, why are you excited today about what the board is doing, about what the organization is doing? As we ask that, as we'll hear that, helpful information for us. Often we don't know this if we haven't asked it before, but definitely helpful for board members to know about each other and often causes some really powerful engagement we've seen. And the organizations that have done this really seen some real benefit from it. A couple other options. We could share an article ahead of time, right? Preferably a shorter one than a longer one. Then have a little bit of a conversation about that article at the beginning of our board meeting. And we could also bring a staff person there to kind of introduce, talk about their work a little bit, hopefully share a little bit about the impact of the organization. All right, and then our final section we'll talk about when it comes to engaging board members. And then we'll save a few minutes for any questions folks have before we go to our last session today, for a panel on staff management, is around board communications. So when we think about sharing information with our board and kind of keeping our board updated, we're really kind of balancing kind of two or three big things, right? One is our own capacity. We have a million things to do. How do we kind of find the time to communicate to our board, right? What do we need to communicate? What should we communicate? What can we skip? We don't have probably a lot of free time for a lot of this, right? So we're thinking about what do we have to communicate to our board? How do I save some time from it? Secondly, we're thinking about what does the board want to hear, right? The board, like all of us, gets a ton of emails. They probably get a ton of emails from our organization already. So how am I sharing information they're actually interested in, actually excited to engage with? And then finally, what information can I share, right? What do I have kind of that's timely? What do I have that's going to be interesting? What do I have that's not a lot of time to pull? All going to be really important questions there. So with those kind of three caveats in mind, kind of what is some of the information we recommend? The first is really thinking about kind of what topics, the second we'll talk about how frequently and how communicate with our board. But first is just kind of what topics might I want to share with my board? And specifically, we're talking here about how we inform our board outside of just board meetings, right? So board meetings, obviously I'm giving them a packet, we're walking through an agenda, et cetera. So instead I'm thinking about outside of board meetings, how am I engaging folks, right? What am I kind of telling them so they're not just here, especially if you're quarterly, we can't go kind of 3 months, right, without talking to our board. So how are we kind of giving them updates? We might be telling them strategic updates, referring back to kind of our current strategic plan or strategic goals, previous decisions we talked about, and if things are going well or not, right? But giving them an update on some of the strategic goals we might have in some of those different areas of the organization. We might be, and this is the most common one, just sharing updates from the organization, kind of organizational news, right? Program achievements, milestones we hit, updating on progress, right? If we're in the middle of a process or, if we're working towards a goal, but helping them just kind of know what's happening with the organization. And finally, and maybe most importantly, but probably least often done, is sharing opportunities for the board to get involved in some way. So ways the board can support. So it could be chances to volunteer, it could be chances to view the programming, right, do a site visit, it could be a fundraising or awareness campaign that they can participate in. But we're thinking about how the board can get involved in some way with the work on some level. Secondly, this is a really important part of the communication, so it doesn't end up taking a bunch of your time, which we don't have a lot of, right? Setting expectations for these communications. I'm not sending a daily update to my board, right? So, how often are we communicating to it, getting them in a regular flow of, maybe I send a monthly informal little update newsletter. Maybe I send every few Fridays. When I send it, maybe it's Friday morning, right? Whatever it is, but setting some kind of set expectations, formally or informally, about the interval and the timing of this, when this comes out, the method it's coming out, is it video, is it text, is it email, thinking about kind of what that makes sense and what I want to commit to. Some of the topics, again, also expectation can be set there. Maybe I have a strategic scorecard. It's a visual indicator of my progress towards my strategic goals. I just always share it, right? So they just know to look for it. The more we can get the know to look for feeling, the better it is in terms of how the board's going to engage with that content. And then finally, when thinking about strategic updates. So this is a big question we get asked a lot of times, which is around just how do we think about making sure the board is aware of where we are strategically, right? Where we are against our strategic plan or our strategic goals, our work plan, or some goals that the organization has, right? And we'll share some templates for this. Again, it may not be in your workbook yet, but will be kind of follow-up materials. The first thing we'll say, and the thing we probably see has the biggest impact, is the strategic scorecard. So this is ideally just a kind of a one PowerPoint slide, maybe it's a couple slides, but that type of document, you can do this in Canva also if you wanted to. Doesn't need to be anything really fancy, but a very simple visual indicator of our progress towards some of these different goals. So the two things we might include here. One, we might include some stats every single time. So maybe we have a stat about just our scope of our programming, the number of students we've reached, right? And we just update that every single time. Maybe we have some fundraising stats, right? About how much we've raised from foundation. We're updating that every single time. So they just get used to seeing a couple stats and know to look for those stats. The other thing we might be putting in there again is kind of a visual indicator of our progress against some of our goals. That could be against our budget or against our strategic goals. So you can imagine, right? There's a fundraising scorecard. It has individual and institutional and event and corporate. Each of those is either red, green, or yellow, depending on how we are progressing towards that goal, right? Green means we're crushing it. We're either on pace or ahead of pace. Yellow means that we're a little behind, but we think we can catch up. Red means either we haven't started, something went wrong, or something's really underperforming, right? Being able to do that quickly and have people scan this and be like, okay, individuals green, corporate foundations are yellow, events red. All right, let's focus in on event, right? It's a very easy, quick visual way for the board to kind of assess how things are going and know what questions they might want to ask you. So creating that scorecard, again, getting the template right takes a little bit of time. But once you have it, you're just making that again every board meeting, right? Or making that again every time you're sharing that on a monthly or bi-monthly basis. Not very long, not a lot of effort, but it can make a big difference in board communication we've seen. Secondly, if you do have a strategic plan, making sure at the very least every meeting, if not, once in between meetings, we're referring back to our progress against it. And why this is because we don't want the board, especially if it's a 3 or 5 year plan, I don't want my board overly reacting to how we're doing against it every other month, right, or every quarter. But I do want them to remember we have, right? And I want them to remember what some of those big strategic goals are. So that's why taking it out of the plan, putting it into a scorecard, putting it on a list, right, in Excel or Word, and kind of just having a couple of highlights under each bucket. Important to do so it just stays top of mind. So when I do want them to engage with the strategy again, they're ready and they understand how. And then finally, the last kind of strategic update we're often giving our board is around the budget, right? So we're thinking about the budget versus actual, right? That kind of financial document. At every meeting we're talking about. If you meet monthly, I would do every other month for the budget versus actual. And on that, we want to include how did we do last year to this day? How are we doing this year to this day? What's our current budget, right? So I want to say, how am I doing compared to last year? How am I doing compared to my current goals? And the focus of that conversation is really on what the variance is, right? What's ahead or what's behind or what's surprising. And if our board kind of routinely is asking those questions, they're going to have a pretty good understanding of our performance and a lot more so than many organizations that we talk to. And then finally, the last tip we'll talk about here, then we'll pause for any questions before we take a couple-minute break before the panel begins. It's just a few other things that we recommend that can help with board communications. I would not do all of these. I'd reference the first thing we said this morning, right? Pick one or two from every session, right? To maybe take. This would definitely be one of those where we're taking one or two of these. One of my favorites that's on this slide is this "What's on My Mind." This is just a monthly informal email from the executive director, update over email for folks. That's simply telling them like, hey, here's the big things I'm thinking about, right? Maybe a couple wins, maybe a couple potential challenges, and maybe one or two other kind of updates, right? But just here's the things that are taking up headspace, helping both kind of normalize the power dynamics of the board ED relationship, but also letting them kind of see a little bit behind the curtain about what we're thinking about, what we're prioritizing. Secondly, as we get wins, we might have a kind of standard format that we're sending out, no more than probably weekly. That hey, here's the big stuff coming in. We're really excited by X, Y, or Z thing that happened. The more we're doing that, the more celebratory it feels, the more excited the board is about our performance. The scorecard we already talked about, that can be really helpful to share either in between meetings or at meetings. For the board chair, making sure we're sending an update for the chair to possibly send. It'd be really ideal if not every update to the board came from us. But again, as we're hoping that the board begins to manage itself, the chair sending a couple of these updates, even if we have to write the first couple, is a good first step. And then finally, one example we saw one of our partners do that we thought was interesting is that for 1 hour every other month, like on a Friday morning, they hop on Zoom as an open office hours for their board. That if anyone wants to come and just share a cup of coffee virtually, right? See how things are going, ask about the organization, have questions about it. The ED kind of hops on there. Most of the time, no one joins. They just do their work. The board's really appreciated the access, and it's not a big lift, right? It's not a lot of time you have to prep for there. So that's one thing we've seen an organization do to kind of help improve that kind of flow of communication. So with that, I'll stop sharing my screen here and pause for any questions folks have before we take a short kind of couple-minute break and come back for our last session of the day, which will be our nonprofit panel. Any questions folks have? Feel free to put it in the chat or unmute. Someone was asking, is there a percentage of the board being engaged at any one time I should shoot for as a goal? Obviously all of us probably would say 100% in a perfect world, but probably isn't super realistic. So, if you're thinking about it, you have 10 or 12 board members, I would say, if you at any time have, 70, 75% of them really engaged, kind of, following through on things that you're asking them to, feeling committed to it, that's probably a great place to start. But the biggest thing I would say is wherever you are today. The goal is that, a year from now, when you come back, we're talking about boards at next year's summit. We're always talking about boards, that more of your boards engaged then than it is now, right? So it's all about that progress piece. If you only have one engaged board member now, it's really powerful to get to two or three. Tomorrow we'll talk about board recruitment. That's a great way to get new people in. That's a really powerful engagement technique as well. We talked about things exclusively today for kind of the board members we already have. Sometimes the best strategy is getting new board members as well, right? It can kind of change the climate and culture on the board. Great question. Any other questions for a wrap up?
Yes, thank you. What's the average board donation you're seeing?
Yeah, so the average in our network is $1,000 if there's a formal kind of give or get. The national average is 5,000. That's factoring in kind of much larger organizations. We have partners that number is as low as $250, and partners that it's as high as 10,000. But the majority are kind of around that 1,000 mark.
Thank you.
Great. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and pull up our kind of title slide as we give folks just a couple minutes to grab some coffee, some water, take a little break, and then stay on this Zoom link for our panel with some great nonprofit leaders talking about staff engagement, staff volunteering in just a couple of minutes. Thank you all.